Hi class, we're going to resume with our notes, so go ahead and have your section for notes ready, and you will of course be copying these down closely. Make sure that you write everything down, and there may be some other information that you'd like to write in addition to what I've written, but you will also be turning these into paraphrase. So this is where you start with your paraphrase. You don't need to paraphrase the endnote information, just this information as we're starting here. Now, a little bit of review from last week. We have reached the point where the Roman Empire has been being pushed back. Now, of course, it reached its greatest extent under Hadrian, and that period of history, Rome actually extended into Scotland. And so now it's being pushed back, and they're pulling back some of the frontiers, and they're trying to make it a little easier to defend. The barbarians are still very active on the outskirts of the empire, and so Rome adopts a policy of containment, which we talked about, a very important policy, and it was basically, rather than go out and try to defeat the Germans, or instead of fighting them, what you do is you create a buffer, these tribes from Rome. And so put a buffer between the Roman people and these tribes. And so what they did is they built, part of their strategy was to build walls. And we mentioned three major walls that were built. Probably the most famous one is Hadrian's Wall across northern England, separating England from Scotland. And they also put settlers, particularly Roman troops who retired, into these frontier areas where they would be the first people overrun by a barbarian invasion, but they would also tend to fight the barbarians. So because they were former troops, they're retired, the Romans thought, hey, let's give them land as part of their severance, as part of sort of a retirement pay, but the land will be up there in an area called Dacia. So Dacia, this whole region, the whole purpose of this was to create a buffer. Put Roman troops, settle them there, and they will also tend to hold back the barbarians. So, good, solid, thinking, very logical thinking. What's interesting is that it didn't work, and ultimately the barbarians jumped over the walls, and the barbarians fought through some of these former troops. And then the Romans had another really brilliant idea, and that was to hire the barbarians as soldiers and let the legions have many of these barbarians. Now that was probably the dumbest move of them all, to hire barbarians to look after the border and oppose the barbarians that are trying to come in. So that seems the ultimate in futility, and or maybe it's ultimate in stupidity, but at any rate, it shows the lack of character in the Romans. At this point, the Romans are kind of falling to pieces. They are really putting Band-Aids on deep wounds, and they're trying to hold back these things with just very poor remedies. So Caesar, of course, became famous fighting the barbarians in Gaul and then subduing the Gauls and the three countries there. The Celts, the Aquitani, and the Belgae are those three areas of Gaul, three main regions. And he subdues those and then goes across, and we read a little bit last week from his conquest of England, so the very first invasion of England. So basically, we concluded last week by saying that the barbarians did not think that these things the Romans were doing were very smart either, and the barbarians were actually emboldened. Okay, they were emboldened by the hesitancy of the Romans. Now, why was this? Well, I think the Romans were becoming hesitant. Number one, they had become very lazy. They had had slaves for centuries at this point, so slavery really was something that was acceptable, and they figured their slaves would take care of things. And so now this laziness and this view of having someone else take care of your problems really is going to promote this idea of hiring barbarians, okay, to do all your dirty work for you and do the fighting up on the frontiers. So that's not going to work. But secondly, other elements that are working against the Romans is that they had seen much corruption in the empire. They had seen and heard of emperor after emperor after emperor, and there had been so many emperors overthrown and replaced with another emperor that they had really suffered a loss of confidence in the empire. You know, they saw these problems pressing in on them, and they simply had lost confidence in their leadership and in this idea of really solving the problem. So they were kind of accustomed now to putting Band-Aids on problems and not really attacking the root. So I would say this would be a character issue at this point. The Roman character was very weak. They were willing to settle for poor results, not results, but poor remedies for these results. Another thing that had happened was that, and this is attributed by several historians, is that the lead pipes throughout the Roman Empire, of course, lead is poisonous and had begun to take its toll, and it poisoned and was working on really diminished brain power among the Romans. Lead will kill brain cells. And so this was slowly poisoning the people of Rome. And I'm sure that was a factor. I think a bigger factor, in my estimation, is they had reached a point where Rome was no longer worth fighting for. They had figured, we really are a bunch of terrible people, and we're pretty lazy, and we don't really stand for anything noble. Used to be, we thought Roman law and Roman citizenship, it was worthy to extend that, but I'm not sure anymore. And so I think what we see, and we see this in their writers and in their poets, who say that Rome is not worth fighting for. It's no longer worth the sacrifice. Why sacrifice? We're going to just fall. And, it's easy to get that attitude. You have to really be strengthened with believing in something that's beyond yourself. You have to really be believing you're fighting for something worthy. You're fighting for your families. You're fighting for something that's going to last longer than your life. And so there was a movement that was springing forth, and it was Christianity. It was Christianity, and Christianity was growing like wildfire. There was huge growth in Christianity at this time. The church was local, self-governing churches, apostles, Peter, Paul were very active in spreading and evangelizing people. Paul takes the gospel to the Gentiles, and we know that that happens. His first convert in Europe was Lydia, there of Thyatira, and in Acts 17, she's converted. I believe it's Acts 17. She's converted to the gospel, and she's a wonderful lady. And so the gospel is spreading. Now, some attributed the fall of Rome to the fact that these these weak Christians were being accused, the Christians who believed in peace, and they were not as tough and didn't have that strong kind of like killer instinct that the Romans had. And so the empire was becoming soft. And some have accused the Christians of actually causing the fall of the Roman Empire. And so let me just try to state that here, was that the soft character of the Christians was criticized as being a factor. Okay, so that being a factor. Now, there's a couple problems with that, is that there were a number of people who didn't buy that. In fact, they felt like that was just an excuse of the Romans, kind of blame it on somebody else. Okay, so an example was the Bishop of Hippo, and he stood against that, and God, what is his name? Marcy? Yeah. Who's the famous bishop? Yeah, excuse me while I ask Mrs. Kinzer, but St. Augustine. So Augustine, and he's the Bishop of Hippo, one of the key figures in the Christian church. Hippo is a town in North Africa, not too far from Carthage. So Augustine defended the Christians, and he wrote his famous book, City of God, which is basically a manifesto of why the Christians were a benefit to the Roman Empire and not a flaw or a weakening effect. He reasons in that book that because of Christianity, the Roman Empire lasted longer because it produced a strong quality of citizen, and the Christians, by loving one another and taking care of the poor and taking care of the outcasts. You got to remember, Rome would actually take little girls when girls were born, and they would just leave them outside the city walls because girls were not worth as much as boys. They couldn't lift, they couldn't run as fast, they couldn't throw a spear as well. And so they actually left lots of girls outside on the ground, and the wolves would come by. Well, Christians would go out at nightfall, just so no, because it was illegal. They didn't want people rescuing these girls, these girl babies, and so Christians would go out and illegally risk their lives and risk their jail time to grab these little ones and save them. And so the Christian church tended to have more women in it. As a result, it was, but it was also saving the lives of women and these little babies. So I think to our credit, to Christians' credit, there was much good that they were doing. But secondly, besides this excuse, and that great men like Augustine said, no, that's not the case at all. Think about it for a minute. Would soft character Christians be able to stand against persecution the way they did? I mean, if you were a bunch of soft Christians, would you be willing to go to the Colosseum and have lions tear you from limb to limb, limb from limb? Would Christians be crucified, and during Nero's realm have Christians lit on fire and used as torches? If Christians were weak and vacillating and compromising, they wouldn't stand for that. So the very idea that Christians were weak is a ridiculous one. The church was growing, and even while it was being persecuted, that's not a sign of weakness. Okay, so I think that's a poor excuse that the Romans put forth, but an important one. And it's important for you to know that one of the greatest books of all time in Christian history, The City of God, is written in response to that accusation. So barbarians were certainly emboldened, but I don't believe it was because of Christians being weak. So the disciples were very active. Peter and Paul were preaching. The other disciples went out as well. And some of you know that Paul was beheaded and Peter was crucified, and he asked to be crucified head down, which was even more excruciating. And he did not want to be crucified like Jesus. He felt like that was too good for him. So he was crucified in a more brutal way. And both of them were crucified during the time of the Emperor Nero. So this is that first great persecution. We mentioned last week that in 325 AD, Constantine called for the first great church conference, the Council of Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea. And this is where the famous Nicene Creed was stated. This council really weighed the claims of the Arian heresy. So Arius and the Arian heresy said that Jesus was not divine, he was an angel. Okay, so one of the issues that they stated was, no, Jesus is divine, he is not lower, but he's fully God. So if you read the Nicene Creed, it makes that statement. Jesus is not an angel. He's fully divine. Another big issue that council tackled was that priests certainly want to marry. They want to marry. And if you're not married and a priest, don't get married. But if you are married, you can become a priest, okay? If you're already married, you can stay as a priest. So, in other words, if you're married already, see if I can print that. So if you're already married, continue as a priest. But if you are single, don't marry. Stay single. And of course, the term for that is celibacy. So this idea that the priest would remain celibate or single becomes a key doctrine of the priesthood in the Catholic Church. Okay, so during the time of Diocletian, we had the most serious, this was the most severe persecution. And he also divides the empire. And the empire has gotten so big that he sets up an Eastern empire and a Western empire. And so one of the things that we see is that the Eastern Church, that is the church, the church that's not the Roman Church. The Roman Church is in Rome, but the Eastern Church has a headquarters, and that is in Constantinople. And so you begin to see, because the church, the Roman Church, has kind of allied itself and kind of connected itself to the politics of the day. Now, when the empire divides, and there's an Eastern and a Western empire, the church divides. And this Eastern Church that's headquartered in Constantinople is, of course, that's later Byzantium. And so Byzantium is the more modern name, and it's the headquarters of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Okay. Now, so we have this Eastern Orthodox Church. I'm going to put down EOC actually. EOC. This later divides into two churches. So this church that's in Constantinople divides. And it breaks into the Greek Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox, and the Russian Orthodox. Now, the Russian Orthodox Church has its headquarters in Moscow, but the Greek Orthodox Church, its headquarters is in Istanbul, which is really the modern name for Constantinople and Byzantium. So Istanbul is where the Eastern, or the Greek Orthodox Church is, and Moscow is where the Russian Orthodox Church is headquartered. And they're similar in a lot of ways. One of the big differences is that they just see their authority coming from a different area. So we're going to move ahead onto our next slide at this point, next part.